Hello, my name is Seth Hanasek, and I'm here to talk about the fundamentals of HotDocs Author, the template authoring environment for HotDocs Advanced, the newest and latest version of HotDocs. When talking about HotDocs, it's important to remember that even though it's a very complex piece of software that looks a little intimidating the first time you see it, it's actually very straightforward. There are basic principles. Once you grasp them, you'll understand everything that you need to know about HotDocs template authoring. I group those principles together in what I call the periodic table of HotDocs templates. And the first part of that periodic table, the very first element, is the template. A HotDocs template is the most important part of any HotDocs system because it's based on the content that's going to drive everything. If you don't have any template content, HotDocs doesn't do anything. The templates are based on content that you provide, based on documents that you already use. We take those source documents and we turn them into templates. Anytime we have a Word document that we want to turn into a template, we can do that with HotDocs Author. So I have here a plain Word document that hasn't been touched by HotDocs, but it's an employment agreement. It's pretty straightforward. I would like to turn this into a HotDocs template. I can do that by opening HotDocs Author and adding a new template to my workspace, or I can use the Create Template button in Word to convert the current open Word document into a HotDocs Author template. I'll provide it with a name. And a title, and an optional description. HotDocs will make a copy of the source document, and it will open my new template in Word. And if you'll see, this is the template, and this is my source document. They look very similar because they are copies of one another. The template itself is stored as a Word document in Word format, so we can retain all of the fidelity of the source document, including all the Word-specific features that make that document that document. We can retain headers and footers, page numbering, tables of contents, cross-referencing, named styles, automatic numbering, table layouts. Anything you can do in Word, we can do with a HotDocs template. Now, a template on its own doesn't do anything particularly useful. We need to give it instructions on how to change. We do that by adding HotDocs placeholders. A placeholder is a field that represents a HotDocs instruction. And in most cases, that placeholder is going to take the form of a variable field. Now, when you're working with HotDocs templates, it's important to remember how the templates are constructed. The template itself is a Word document, but in the background, we're also creating, and the HotDocs is managing for you, a special file called a component file. So each time we create a HotDocs instruction, sitting behind it is a HotDocs specific component. And if we create a question that represents someone's name and add a placeholder into the document, that placeholder is actually referring to a component that sits in the component file. And the component contains all the definitions of how that question is meant to be asked, what sort of answer it will accept, how it's meant to be formatted in the document, and so on. All its underlying behavior is defined in the component. The placeholder field is simply a reference to that component. So we'll create a single question, but we can have many, many placeholders in the document referring to that question. The question will only be asked to the user one time, but it will be placed in the document multiple times. When we want to add placeholders to the document, we first need to define where that placeholder is going to exist. Just make this. Now here I have the name Greg Alberts. This is an old agreement from quite some time ago, and all the data in here is irrelevant. I don't need to know that data. I want to replace that with my HotDocs instructions. So to add a variable, a question to the interview, and place its answer in the document, I need to select the text that I'm going to replace with my instruction, And then I'm going to use this field editor on the right to add a placeholder. This is by far the most common instruction that you're going to be adding to a document. You also don't have to highlight any text. If you put your cursor in the document, your placeholder will go exactly where your cursor is. But I'm going to do a replace of this text. So I'm going to add a placeholder, and then I have to choose the type of placeholder. And most of the placeholders I'm going to add will be for variables. So I'm going to create a text variable, and the type of variable we choose will determine the sort of question that's asked. And text variables are the simplest, they're the most common, and the most flexible. We need to give the variable a name, and this is going to represent the employee and their name. So I'll name this variable employee name. You can name variables whatever you like, but they should be something understandable. They should indicate the nature of the question, and all our variables must be unique. We can't have two variables or other HotDocs components with the same name, so we want to make sure we give all of our components unique names. When we create our components, or when we refer to a component in this field properties window, it'll let us know if that variable doesn't exist. So HotDocs is prompting me to say, I'm going to create this variable now. If it already exists, we'll have the opportunity to reuse them, but I'm going to create this variable right now. And then I'm going to add my field to the document, but I don't want to add it just once. I would like to search for the name, Greg Alberts. So we are going to do a multiple search and replace for Greg Alberts. And I'm just going to do replace all. So everywhere it finds that name, it's going to add my new text variable placeholder. It tells me how many times it was able to replace that text. And it adds these placeholder fields into the document. You'll notice they are surrounded by boxes, and they have this little handle over on the side. These HotDocs fields are actually Word objects. They're called content controls that HotDocs can interact with in real time. So when I make changes to the text of the document or these components or each of these fields, they're updated automatically. I don't have to save anything because it saves as it goes. And when I select one of these fields by clicking in it, it gives me the details of that field, and I can modify them and make changes, and those changes will happen immediately. So I can see them as we go. Here's another example. This is going to be a date variable. So I can select this text, the 14th day of December, and I can add a placeholder for a date variable. So this is going to be accepting a date as an answer. The user has to enter a valid date when they answer the question. This is the date of the agreement. And again, it doesn't exist, so I'm going to create it. But HotDocs, because I have selected this text and indicated that I wanted to create a date question, HotDocs has anticipated the format that I would like to see. But we can choose from any number of available date formats. And this is important because when the user answers this question, they don't need to know this information. They don't need to know how the document is built or how it's meant to look when they're done. All they need to do is answer a valid date with a day, a month, and a year. And as soon as the template gets that information, we as the authors can determine how that date is meant to be formatted or presented in the text of the document. And there's a number of built-in date formats here, but I can select the default that HotDocs assumes that I want to use based on the text I'm replacing, or I can create my own date format by just typing into this field using that DMY notation. So it manages the formatting for each question separately. Here, I want to add the annual salary as a number placeholder. But salary has some specific properties that make it behave like currency. So I can edit these components anytime I create them. When they're created, when I click that create button and add the placeholder, it also creates this component in the component file, and the component determines how the question behaves. So I can modify its behavior by editing the component using this edit component button. It will open my variable component for editing, and I can change a number of different properties for it. In this specific case, I want to change the number of decimal places that the user is allowed to enter in their answer using this setting here. I also want to add a units, a currency unit symbol next to the field when it's asked to indicate to the user that this is a currency amount and not some other type of number. If I need or want to, for any of these questions, we can change the prompt so the wording of the question can be tailored to make the most sense to the end user. So our prompts can be more descriptive if they need to be. I can say, please enter the full amount of the annual salary below. And I also would like it to be formatted as currency. And I could do that for the field, but I can actually change it in the component. I'll pick a currency format here, and you'll see there's a number of other built-in number formats. And again, I can write my own number formats if I want to. I can select the currency format, and this will be applied everywhere this number is used by default. Because it's a currency amount, it always wants to be in a currency format unless I tell it differently. And once I've set all of these options, I just need to close this window. It updates that component in real time, and then I can add the field to the document. Again, this question will get asked, and the answer will be placed into the document where this placeholder appears, and any appropriate formatting will be applied at that point. Here we've got the number of available holiday or vacation days for a user. Again, this is a number. But I want to reuse that information here, but spell it out as text. Anytime we create one of these components, it is stored in that component file and can be reused at any point. HotDocs hates it when you have to do things 2 times. So everything we do in HotDocs is reusable. I can pick from my existing components rather than create new ones. And again, I can apply a different format to this field. This field has correctly anticipated the format I would like to use, but I could pick any of a number of other number formats, and I can add my field to the document. And anytime you've got a field-specific format applied, so a format that applies only to that particular field and not any others, it appears in the field, so it's visible, and we can tell where special formatting is being used. Here we have the name of the person who is signing this agreement, and I don't want the user to type in any name that they think of or something that isn't even a name. I would like them to choose from an existing list of people who have the authority to fill in this document. So I can add a placeholder for a variable called a select variable. In this case, I only want to pick from one option from the list, so I am going to choose a single select variable, but we can also create multi-select variables that let multiple selections happen. And a select variable just lets us define all of the options that the user can pick from. I can add whatever names might be appropriate. And these will be the selections that the user can pick. If I make changes, I can update them here. And of course, I can add the field once I'm done. The user will be presented with a list of selections that they can pick from, and their selected option will appear in the document. Once we've set up all of our variable placeholders, we can then start looking at organizing them in a way that's presentable to the user. We do that by creating a special component type called a dialog. A dialog is just a collection of questions. It's a way of grouping together related variables so that they're asked to the user on a single screen. When we want to create dialogs in the template, there's several places where we can do that. The first is at the point when we create our variables. If I create a new text variable for the employees address, I can also create a dialog by just adding a new name here. So we'll create a dialog for the details of the employee here. It'll let me know that it doesn't exist the same way it does with variables. And I have a single button that will create our variable and the dialog and link them together in one step. Once I've created the dialog, I can go to any of these other fields and select my dialog to have it linked to that variable and vice versa. It'll let me know if that link doesn't exist, and it'll give me a button that'll allow me to create it. I can also create dialog components directly in the component file without working with the fields using a tool called the Component Studio. The Component Studio lists all of my existing components over here on the left. The current component that's selected will appear over here on the right. And I can also create new components from this list. So I'm going to create a new dialog component called agreement details. And my agreement details dialog needs some contents. So a dialog acts as a container for existing variables, and I want to add some variables to this dialog. This is going to have the agreement date, which I will drag from my list over on the right into the contents list on the left. I can also drag the signatory over here. When I'm done editing one of these, I can close its tab using this little X, or I can leave it open and have a series of variables or other components listed that are all active. If I have changes to the component file, there will be a small asterisk in the name of the component file up at the top, and I can just save that before I close it to make sure those changes get saved. We can also create another dialog for the job details. And that's going to have the date of employment, the job title, and the annual salary, as well as the number of holiday days and paid seminar days that I'm entitled to, and the length of any initial term. Now, at any point while I'm developing, I can test the interview of my template. I can make sure that the user is experiencing things the way that I think they should. So when I click the test button, HotDocs will generate an interview by reading the template the same way you would, top to bottom, left to right. And when it finds things that it needs, when it finds instructions that it needs to interpret, it asks the questions it needs in order to interpret those instructions. And it does that by using the dialogs that we built and any other variables that it needs that aren't on dialogs. And it shows the interview to me in this fashion. We have the outline on the left and the currently selected dialog on the right. Now in this test, I can see that I have the order of these two variables backwards. I'd like to ask the name first and then the address. So I need to edit the component. If I right-click, I can see when I'm testing that I've got the order of these questions incorrect. I'd like to reorder them. And I do that by right-clicking on the title of the dialog over here in the test. And a menu pops up that lets me edit the component. If I click that, it will actually open the Component Studio to the relevant dialog, and I can change anything in this component that I need to. In this case, I want to go to the Layout tab of the dialog, and I can actually reorder these questions by just dragging them up and down the list. I can also, if I want to, put them side by side, up to 3 across. So I have some ways to organize these dialogs to make them more friendly to users. In this case, I just want to reorder those two questions. I can save what I'm doing. I can close the Component Studio, and I can click the test button again to update the test. And there's my reordered questions, which look correct. Here's another error. I've put a capital L here where I don't want it. I can right-click on that prompt, edit the component, and I can modify the prompts and update the test. And it will show me those updates in real time. And when I'm done testing, I can just close that window. So we can use the Component Studio to create our dialogues, or we can create them through the fields. And we can test our interview to make sure the dialogues are being asked the way that we expect. When we have templates, placeholders, and dialogues, we now have a functioning template. And in order to gather the information we need an interview. And as you've seen, HotDocs will generate an interview for you by default. But there are some ways that we can control how that interview behaves and how we interact with it inside the template, rather than leaving everything up to HotDocs. One of the ways that we can control how the interview works is by taking advantage of a special placeholder, which if you can't see it here, you can use this link that says more over in the field editor to expand the options. One of the placeholders we can add places a dialogue in the interview. And when HotDocs builds the interview automatically, it asks the questions in the order that it finds them. In this case, it finds the first field, which is the employee name, and it will ask the employee details dialog. Then it finds the agreement date placeholder, and it asks the agreement details dialog. But if I would like the details of the agreement to be asked first, I simply have to put my cursor somewhere above where the other fields are and add a field or a placeholder field to place a dialog in the interview. In this case, I'm going to choose the agreement details and add the field, and it puts in something called an ask field. And now when I test, instead of asking the employee details first, the instruction that HotDocs sees first will be for the agreement details, and it will ask that first. So we can use these ask instructions to change the order in which the dialogues are asked. Once we have a functioning interview that's asking the right questions, now we can start looking at changing the structure of the document. The most common way to do that is through the use of conditional statements. So we can define sections of text that might be relevant or might not be relevant. In this template, there is a paragraph about paid time away to attend work-related seminars. And some employees will have this as part of their contract and some won't, but I need to ask the question that determines whether they're going to get this as part of their contract or not. I would need to select this optional paragraph, and the text might be any length. It can be a paragraph, it can be a sentence, a word, a page. HotDocs doesn't really mind. As long as we select all of the optional text, we can create something called a conditional region. When we do that, we can define the condition that we would like to use. For instance, I can ask a yes/no question about whether paid seminar day is necessary. Just a yes/no question, would you like to include the paragraph about paid seminar days? But we can also use other conditions. For instance, we can set a threshold for the annual salary. And if the annual salary is greater than or equal to a certain minimum, let's say $45,000 per year, then the user, or the employee rather, will get the paid seminar days automatically as part of their contract if their annual salary is above a certain level. When you create a conditional region, HotDocs surrounds it with two fields. There is an if field and an end if field. And the combination of those two fields determine what text is going to get either deleted or left behind. HotDocs will check this condition. In this case, it's going to look at the answer of the annual salary and see whether it's above or below 45,000. If it's equal to or above it, it will leave the paragraph alone and just remove the if at the end if. But if it's below it, it will delete that paragraph. And we can use combinations of these to make whatever changes in the document that we might need. For instance, here we have a paragraph about a probationary period or an initial term of employment. And again, some employees will require this as part of their contract and some won't. So we can create a conditional region and I can ask a yes/no question about whether there is an initial term. I can add that to the document. If we have any mutually exclusive options or different versions of a paragraph, we can use these conditions to switch between the two. If I decide that not having an initial term means that we still need a clause in the document that says there will be no initial term of probation, I can link this paragraph with its opposite so that only one of them is visible at a time. And we do that by selecting the end if and then the next optional bit of text. And we can create something called an else statement. And an else statement is just a way of linking another piece of text, another paragraph or sentence, with a previous version. If we have multiple versions, if this is dependent on a selection variable, for instance, where there are 5, 6, 7 different options and there's 7 different clause options, we can link them together using else if to check conditions in a series. So it checks the first condition, then the second, then the third. But in this case, it's either a yes or a no. So we can just use an else. And our end if gets changed to an else, and it adds a new end if after the second version. So it checks our condition. If it's true, it adds the first paragraph and removes everything else. But if it's false, it checks the else and it adds the second version of text and removes everything else. We can link these together in any combinations that we like. We can have multiple else ifs. So we can have several different mutually exclusive versions of a bit of text. We can add an else, a default else option right at the end of it. We can nest these conditions, so you can have conditions inside other conditions. They're all interdependent, so the inner conditions are only checked when the outer conditions are checked. This is how we define complex business rules inside the document to determine how all the changes need to be made. And a single template can contain lots and lots of different versions of itself that it can output. We do that all using conditional statements. This concludes the first part of our overview of HotDocs fundamental principles. We've covered 5 of the base principles. There are a few more that we're going to cover in part 2. In the meantime, thanks very much for your time and attention. I hope this was of some use to you. If you would like more information about HotDocs Author and HotDocs Advanced, you can contact us at our website on abacusnext.com, or you can email us at hdinfo@abacusnext.com. Thanks.